Hello and welcome. My name is Eric VanEpps. I'm an assistant professor of marketing here at the Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah. I'm excited to present some of my research today. Today I'm going to be discussing two projects that have a shared link. They're about questions, how we should ask questions, why we sometimes don't ask questions, and getting an understanding of all of these things from a research perspective. So the title of today's talk is The Questions We Ask or Not. And with that, I'm going to dive right in. So in today's talk, I want to mostly think about two central research questions. The first, and this is one project with some co-authors, is why should we be more willing to ask difficult questions? That we're often reticent to ask what we consider sensitive questions, and what research can tell us about why we should actually be more willing to ask those difficult questions. And then the second project, still related, we're going to talk about many of the same ideas, but is asking how we ask the right questions to get honest answers. You may have heard before that there's no such thing as a stupid question. We're going to challenge that a little bit, and we're going to say that there are actually important ways that we should ask questions, things that we should think about in terms of our phrasing to actually convey the information we want to convey and get honest answers. So that'll be coming up. That'll be in the second half of the talk. The first half, like I say, is going to be focused on why we should be more willing to ask difficult questions. And so this is work with two of my colleagues, Ina Hart and Marie Schweitzer, and it's work that's currently under review. So it's not published anywhere. You're kind of getting a sneak peek at this research. And the title of this project, this paper, is The Better Than Expected Consequences of Asking Sensitive Questions. So when we're thinking about asking sensitive questions, I think many of us are concerned with what we would call impression management, that we're worried that the impression that we're going to give by asking a sensitive question, by asking somebody about their salary or something quite personal, might actually backfire and hurt the impression we make on people. And what research shows is that individuals often engage in a whole variety of impression management tactics that end up backfiring. You might be familiar with a few of these. There have been terms like humble bragging and backhanded compliments. I'll give an example of a humble brag here. This has become more and more prominent via Twitter and other forms of social media. I'll read this one aloud. This person said, "No makeup on, hair's not done, pretty sure I'm not wearing deodorant, still get hit on, sigh." And so this is intended to be a humble message about how things aren't, pity me, woe is me, things aren't going the way I want them to, but yet they're still conveying that they look so attractive without putting makeup on or with toothpaste stains that they're still getting hit on. And so it's an impression management tactic. This person is trying to both appear humble as well as boast about their appearance. But what has been shown in a number of research articles, as well as maybe some common sense, is that these kinds of messages don't actually improve the impressions that we make on other people, that we might think that we're conveying both humility and the thing that we want to brag about. In reality, people hate these kind of messages. They read a humble brag and they go, this is a person that I wouldn't want to interact with. And so, again, there's lots of academic research talking about these kinds of impression mismanagement tactics. And we're going to discuss how question asking, something that we maybe do or don't think about as an impression management tactic, might actually be leading us away from some of the questions we should ask because we're so worried about the impressions that we make. And so the kind of central question here, the way that we kind of started on this line of research, is this central idea here at the top of this slide. If we don't understand the impressions we make in other settings, if we don't understand that humble bragging might backfire, or that some of the compliments we might issue might backfire, or the ways that we post pictures on Instagram might backfire, is there any reason to expect that people are better at knowing how others react to our questions? Or might there be a whole host of forecasting mistakes, mental model errors that people are making in this context as well? We think that asking sensitive questions will offend other people, but perhaps we aren't understanding the actual impact of the questions we ask. And so here our predictions are listed out. One, we think that askers are going to be overly concerned about whether conversation partners like them. So when I'm asking a question, I worry too much about whether you like me, and that makes me avoid asking sensitive questions in the first place. And then a second prediction is that when sensitive questions are asked, question respondents are actually less affected by these sensitive questions than askers expect. And so it's this two-pronged thing. Askers think they shouldn't ask sensitive questions because of what we perceive to be a misprediction that they think others will be offended. And sure enough, we're going to show some evidence that people aren't that offended by sensitive questions. Okay. Some of the questions that we use in this project, you could certainly think of a whole variety of sensitive and non-sensitive questions. We don't mean to say that we've kind of covered all of the potential bases, but rather we think of this as a proof of concept and a way to think about sensitive questions. So we ran some pilot studies, some initial data collection efforts, and asked people to report some sensitive questions, things that they would be uncomfortable asking other people, or that they would potentially be uncomfortable answering themselves, to give us kind of an initial starting point. And then we continue to test and refine those questions before using them in our studies that I'll present in a couple slides. So examples of sensitive questions would be things like asking about sexual infidelity. Have you ever cheated on a partner? Asking questions about salary and finances are often considered pretty sensitive. So something like, how much is your salary? As well as questions about criminal behavior or other immoral behavior. Have you ever committed a crime? Non-sensitive questions are much broader. We could have chosen a whole number of different questions that we would call non-sensitive. We chose pretty benign questions, pretty small talk kind of questions in our studies. So things like, what do you think about the weather? Or how did you get your current job? Would be the kinds of sensitive questions that we use in our studies. We have more that are in the studies, and so if you're especially curious about the materials used, I will post my contact information at the end of the presentation today. This gives you kind of a sense, a sampling of what we used in these studies. In the pilot studies, to make sure that we were correctly identifying things that were different from each other, that sensitive questions were meaningfully different from our non-sensitive questions, we had a group of participants rate them on a variety of scales. And sure enough, the sensitive questions were rated as more sensitive, more intrusive, more awkward, more uncomfortable, more likely to have negative consequences for asking these questions, and also, what we think interestingly, more likely to yield valuable information. Because one thing you might be wondering in all of this is, what's the point of asking a sensitive question if it might have all of these negative consequences? Well, we argue that in many contexts, these sensitive questions could yield valuable information. And so we wanted to make sure that our sensitive questions were that type, ones that are valuable. We could learn something useful to know going forward, but there's relationship concerns that might get in the way of us asking these questions. So an example of this might be in the workplace. It could well benefit an individual to learn what the salary of their coworkers are. It might help them negotiate for a better salary themselves, ask for a promotion, whatever it might be. So learning that information could be really valuable. But if you're worried about relation consequences, you're worried about offending your coworkers, you might not ask that information, and you might walk around not knowing what other people are earning, even though that would be useful information to yourself. So that's this initial motivation and this initial set of stimuli that we'll use in the studies that I'm about to discuss. Okay. So study one was conducted online. We recruit participants using a variety of different online survey platforms. A lot of these are pretty exciting platforms for being able to conduct research relatively easily. And so we're in a kind of an amazing era for data collection. Rather than having to recruit people into the lab for all of these studies, sometimes we can just do these online and get people's answers that way. So you'll see in the bottom corner, it says N equals 360. That's saying we had 360 participants in this particular study. And participants were recruited and then were paired with each other. So we have 360 participants. That means we have 180 pairs of participants. And one of those participants is going to be the asker in the study. We tell them that's their role. And the other is going to be the respondent, that they're going to receive some questions and be asked to respond to those questions. The asker was then directed to choose a set of questions that they would ask in the chat part of the study. So they're recruited, they're assigned to their role. Now they're deciding what they're going to talk about when they get to that chat portion of the study. We gave them a set of 10 questions to choose from, and they were supposed to pick 5 of these questions. What this paradigm, this design allowed us to do is see what kinds of questions people are choosing, as well as make sure that people didn't just feel as though they were asking questions that they were forced to ask. They had some autonomy, some selection over the questions that are being used. What we manipulated was whether the set of questions they could choose from was a set of questions that were all pre-tested to be sensitive, things like, what is your salary? Whether they were all 10 questions were things that were non-sensitive, like, what do you think about the weather? Or if they were a half and half mix of sensitive and non-sensitive questions. And so by using this design, we can ensure that those askers that are forced to choose from a set of sensitive questions are indeed going to ask sensitive questions. And we can see what the impact of that is relative to those who are choosing from a mixed set or a set of non-sensitive questions. After they've chosen these questions that they're going to use in the chat, the pair is then engaged in an unconstrained chat. It's a text chat conducted online. So you can imagine a Zoom chat feature or instant messaging. It's that kind of a platform. And the askers are reminded of their chosen questions at the top of the page, so they know what to refer back to, what questions they're supposed to use in this chat. But other than using those chat questions, they can write whatever else they want as part of this, this portion of the study. After they completed the chat, the final thing we asked all of our participants to do is to give some ratings of how the chat went and what they thought of their partner. So the askers gave a prediction, an estimate of what respondents thought of them, right? So it's, I'm trying to imagine what you thought of me, whereas respondents gave their actual impressions. They're saying, well, here's how I actually felt about the asker. And we're going to see whether there's a disconnect, whether askers are believing that respondents felt differently about them than respondents actually felt. Okay. Here is a screenshot, an example screen of what it would have looked like in the study from the asker's perspective. So you can see toward the top of the page, this asker has selected the 5 questions. What genders are you attracted to? Have you ever had an affair? How many kids do you have? What are your views on abortion? How much is your salary? So I would presume, based on these selection questions, this person had a mixed set of questions, some sensitive and non-sensitive, and they chose a couple of each. Something like, have you ever had an affair? Sensitive question, whereas how many kids do you have? Non-sensitive question. So they've chosen some of each, and then in the box below, you can see the actual chat. And so here, person B is the respondent, person A is the asker, and sure enough, person A is jumping right into asking the questions. They say, what are your views on abortion? The person B, the respondent, gives an answer. I believe it should be legal in all cases without exception. And here, the participant has chosen to just go straight into their next question. Have you ever had an affair? That's not required, but it certainly makes sense that when a participant is told you need to ask these questions, they might just go about asking those questions kind of rapid fire. So again, this is an example of what it looks like from the asker's perspective. And then here is an example of what it looks like from the responder's perspective. This is a different chat, but again, the responder has a very similar screen ahead of them. They just don't know ahead of time what those questions are going to be. So the top of the page doesn't include any list of questions. They're just responding to questions as they come in real time. So I want to orient you to this figure. It's kind of the central figure of this talk of understanding the sensitive questions. So let me walk you through it a little bit. I'm going to use my cursor some to make this clear. So on the left over here, we have respondent's comfort, and on the right, we have respondent's overall impression. So if the respondent felt uncomfortable, it might not be that they didn't like the asker or anything like that. They might have just been uncomfortable. Whereas on the right, respondent's impression, that's what they actually thought of the asker. So 2 different dependent variables, 2 different measures of how the respondent felt. And then over here, we have the asker's estimates of the respondent's comfort. So what we can see, this legend says that the dark gray is sensitive, the lines is mixed, and the light gray is non-sensitive, that as askers were forced to ask more sensitive questions, as the set of questions they chose from was more and more sensitive, they estimated that respondents would be less and less comfortable. That it goes from low to high. So this 2.57 says they estimate that respondents are going to be pretty uncomfortable. Similarly, the askers are estimating in that sensitive condition that respondents are going to form worse impressions of the askers. They think that they're making a worse impression by doing all this. So that's their estimates. And then we can show what actually happened, and I'm having a problem showing the result there for that. I apologize. But the general pattern can be shown here on the actual respondent's comfort. The same kind of pattern appears for respondent impression. What we find is that in reality, the sensitive question is not doing worse than the mixed or the non-sensitive. It's doing as well and sometimes even a little bit better. The respondent feels perfectly comfortable answering sensitive questions. And again, I apologize that my screen isn't sharing properly, but in reality, the respondent's impressions are, again, equivalent across these three conditions and all higher than the askers estimated. So the takeaway I want to have here is askers think that when they ask sensitive questions that they're making respondents uncomfortable and that they're making the respondents like them less. In reality, sensitive questions don't really behave differently than non-sensitive questions. Respondents feel as comfortable in both situations, and they feel as positively about the asker in both situations. So that's what we have reported here. There's this substantial underestimation of the impressions made when we ask sensitive questions. In reality, respondents' comfort levels are not affected by the number of sensitive questions they received. So in this project, we conduct a series of studies. In the interest of time, I'm just reporting a couple of these. And so in study 2, we gave people a bonus for making a good impression. They could earn a bonus payment if they actually made a good impression as an asker. And so participants that were incentivized in that way, we randomized some to be incentivized in a different way, some to be incentivized if they made a good impression. When you're incentivized to make a good impression, people are choosing to ask fewer sensitive questions. So they think the way to make a good impression is to ask fewer sensitive questions, even though study 1 just showed that's not the case. It doesn't really make a difference. And then in study 3, we actually gave different bonus payments based on which questions you asked. So we said, we'll pay you more if you ask these more sensitive questions. We'll pay you more if you ask about this person's salary or about their views on abortion or other politically sensitive topics. Even when we paid higher bonuses for choosing to ask sensitive questions, those questions were still often avoided. It wasn't that it just like changed people's behaviors entirely, especially when they were asked to make a face-to-face conversation. People were still really reluctant to ask those questions despite being paid more for them. Again, all of the data, all the stuff I'm sharing with you here, be happy to follow up with anybody offline afterward. We're just moving through this a little bit quickly so that I can get to the other presentation as well, the other project as well. Finally, I want to tell you about study 4 in a little bit more detail. Here, we recruited 254 participants to the labs. They were actually in-person participants that we had, and we paired them again and randomly assigned them to be an asker or respondent. And again, we went through this procedure of having the askers choose 5 questions, but because it's in person rather than via computer, here they wrote them down on a sheet of paper and they took the paper with them for the face-to-face conversation. And so here, the askers and the respondents are both making predictions before the chat and giving impressions after the chat. We're kind of measuring things at all the different data points we could, before and after, asker and respondent. And so on average in this study, they're going to do a face-to-face conversation. They have 5 questions that they're going to choose. They're only choosing for 1.4 on average of those questions to be sensitive, right? So 1 or 2 out of the 5 questions are sensitive. 3 out of the 5 questions are going to be small talk things that I generally find fairly uninteresting, like asking about the weather, but it suggests they're really worried about the impression that they're making. We find that respondents who were asked more sensitive questions felt only slightly less comfortable than those asked fewer sensitive questions, but overall respondents felt more comfortable than they had expected before the chat. So again, we get this misprediction. Askers are avoiding sensitive questions because they think that they're going to make respondents really uncomfortable. Respondents think that they're going to be kind of uncomfortable, and then it turns out when they get sensitive questions, they're actually not that uncomfortable. They don't mind it as much as they think. So everybody kind of has this misprediction where they think sensitive questions are going to be worse than they actually are. Again, there might be some sensitive questions where this wouldn't hold, but for the variety that we use in our studies, and we do use several different sensitive questions, we're finding that people don't mind answering them as much as they predict. Before the conversations, askers underestimated how comfortable respondents would be and respondents' impressions of them. So that's similar to what we saw in study 1. After the conversation, so after they've had this whole interaction, maybe they learned that they didn't make the respondents that uncomfortable, right? They're in a face-to-face conversation. Maybe they would see that the respondent didn't mind and answered and all of that. In reality, askers are still underestimating both the comfort and the impressions. So even when I can see how my conversation partner reacts, I still don't exactly understand how they're feeling relative to their actual behaviors. There's some learning from asking sensitive questions. I get a little bit closer to accuracy in identifying how comfortable you might be, but I don't learn enough to fully update my estimates. I still underestimate the impression that I made on you when I ask sensitive questions. So this might be a lot that I've thrown at you, and I apologize a little bit for moving as quickly as I do. But I want to mostly leave you with this failed mental model. This is kind of a summary of the variety of studies that we have here. One, we as people, participants in our studies, but I think this holds for people in general, we make these predictions that sensitive questions will offend our conversation partners, that if we ask a sensitive question, there's a good chance that they'll be offended. Because we have that prediction, because we have that belief in mind, it leads to this cyclical pattern. Because we have that prediction that sensitive questions will offend, we don't end up asking many sensitive questions. We just kind of go through life a lot of the time trying to have easy conversations. We keep it at what I would call small talk rather than deep talk. We don't ask sensitive questions. Instead, we ask about weather or about what's been going on this past week. What's your evening routine like, or something like that. We don't ask many sensitive questions means that then we don't have an opportunity to learn about how people would respond to sensitive questions. And so because we don't learn, we then can't update our predictions, which in turn feeds back into that initial block that I have at the top of the screen, that we continue to make predictions that sensitive questions will offend. And so the way to break the cycle is to, on occasion, ask a few more sensitive questions. Again, I do want to caution, it's not saying that you should go up to any person on the street and just ask them the most sensitive question you can think of. But if there's a reason that this information could be useful to you, if there's a way that you can make your relationships actually deeper by asking questions that might lead to real meaningful disclosures, those sensitive questions maybe shouldn't be as scary as we think of them in the first place. That we should be a little bit more willing to ask sensitive questions than we generally are. And once we start getting in the pattern, in the habit of asking sensitive questions, we might learn that they're not so scary, that they aren't so offensive, and that's going to change our willingness and our comfort with asking them going forward. So you have to break the cycle. You have to step in and make a change, and then that's going to make it easier and easier from then on. So that's the main takeaway I want to leave with from this first project, that you should feel a little bit more willing to ask sensitive questions. Again, I realize that it might be uncomfortable. We've run yet another study that I haven't presented here, where we actually recruited people to participate in these studies with friends, right? Rather than just participating with strangers, how it goes when participating with friends. We see the same patterns of effects, that people think that their friends are going to be offended by sensitive questions, and that friends aren't as offended as askers initially predict. So we think this holds pretty broadly, and we're optimistic that this can lead to maybe a bit of a change in how people engage with each other and avoid sensitive questions. Maybe they could use these a little bit more. Okay, so I'll leave that there, but certainly would be happy to return to it during the Q&A at the end of all of this. And now I want to shift the attention to a second project. This one's actually already been published, and so you can find the paper online. It's with Julia Mintz and Jeremy Yip and Marie Schweitzer. And here we're looking at how the types of questions we ask can actually impact the answers that we receive. So we call this eliciting the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, the effect of question type on deception. And as I alluded to earlier, here we're looking at how to ask the right questions, how to phrase it in the right way that's actually going to lead to the answer that you are most interested in getting, so that people can't weasel out of your question, is maybe the way to think about it. So I'll start here with a motivating scenario. Imagine that you're looking to buy a house, and you go see a house that you like quite a lot. You ask your realtor, how are the neighbors, right? You're interested, you're worried that maybe the neighbors are going to be noisy. You've got a young child that you want to be able to sleep at night. So you ask, how are the neighbors? You're trying to do your due diligence and make sure that you're not walking into a house where you're going to ultimately be really unhappy with how your neighbors are. And your realtor responds, oh, they're very friendly, right? You asked, how are the neighbors? Your realtor responds, they're very friendly. What your neighbor fails to disclose is that friendly actually means, there's lots of parties going on, and they're not the cleanest people in the world. And all these problems that you actually might have been really worried about were obscured, were not mentioned by the realtor, because the realtor was able to narrowly answer the question, how are the neighbors? Oh, they're really friendly. And so here, what we're proposing is that the question that we ask, the way that we phrase this question, can be really important in terms of constraining the way that the respondent chooses to respond, not giving them a way to kind of give a white lie, as well as that the way that we ask the question can convey our own knowledge, our own intentions, can make us appear more assertive and more able to find out if you're lying to me or trying to obscure the truth. All right, so that's our motivating scenario. And in general, we just want to build from some past research literature that says there are lots of interactions that involve this kind of information asymmetry. What I mean by that term is the realtor has more information than you do as the potential house buyer. And so the realtor, because they're wanting to make a sale, can exploit that information asymmetry through what we would call a self-serving lie. Here, it's a lie of omission. They're choosing not to tell you that the neighbors are as noisy as they are, even though that might have been something that you would have wanted to know. Other times, it's information asymmetry. Could actually be lies of commission, could be active lies. They might try to pull one over on you if they assume that you wouldn't have a way to find out the truth. Right, so here, like I say, includes lies of omission, like the neighbors are very friendly. And what we're positing is that the type of question asked can influence whether people use deception or omit the truth. Okay. We're going to characterize 3 types of questions in this project. This is not the full list of types of questions, but we think this nicely characterizes some of the ways we could have asked this "how are the neighbors" question. So the first type is what we call general. And this is the "how are the neighbors" phrasing. It's a broad inquiry about a situation or a good or a service. And in general, we think because it is so general, because you haven't asked about much that's very specific, it conveys a lack of knowledge or minimal concern about the topic. Like it was just kind of off the top of your head, oh, and how are the neighbors? We think this kind of question is going to allow for the respondent to completely omit the truth, that they don't really have to even get close to the truth or some problem that they wouldn't want to disclose. If the thing the realtor doesn't want to tell you is that the neighbors are really noisy, asking how are the neighbors gives them the ability to completely sidestep that question. They don't even have to talk about it. Another type of question that we could ask would be what we call a positive assumption question. So this is what we might often think of when we're trying to kind of politely build up to a question. It gets at the specific problem, but it communicates an assumption that no problems exist and allows the respondent to just agree without having to really define the terms being used. So here an example would be the neighbors don't get too rowdy, right? This is conveying that I'm aware that rowdiness of my neighbors might be a problem, but because it's saying they don't get too rowdy, right, it's lacking assertiveness. It's not really putting as much onus on the respondents to give me the truth, and that allows for omission by agreement. It's saying, I want you to tell me that the neighbors don't get too rowdy, and so I'm giving you what I want to hear, and so it's often the case that the respondent will just echo that back to me, will give me exactly what I want to hear, even though that might not be the useful information. Finally, what we think will be the most effective in eliciting the truth in these situations where there's a problem that we want to have conveyed, when there's an honest disclosure we want made, is what we call a negative assumption. And so here, the default is that there is some problem, and it's a question of what's the extent of this problem. So a version of this would be, how noisy are the neighbors? You could also flip the phrasing of that positive assumption question and say, the neighbors get pretty rowdy, right? In both of those situations, it's specific and communicates an assumption that some level of problem exists, and we think this conveys more knowledge and more assertiveness on the behalf of the asker. The realtor in this situation can't just completely sidestep and go, well, they're really friendly. You'd be like, you didn't answer my question. When I ask how noisy are the neighbors, you have to say something about their noise level, and I would be able to find out if you weren't being truthful in what you say. Okay, so here I'm going to talk about 2 of the 3 studies of this project. Study 2 I'm going to sidestep for now in the interest of time. But I'll start with study 1 by just looking at broadly this question of, do question types influence disclosure versus omissions? And then in study 3, I'll see whether that proposed mechanism is what holds. Is it the case that when I ask negative assumption questions, I'm more likely to get truthful answers because I convey knowledge and assertiveness? Is that the causal mechanism that's going on here? And that's our story. All right, so study 1 was an online survey, N of 900. We had 900 participants here, and we just asked them to imagine that they were in a hypothetical a job interview, and they're posed a question. And so we're interested in how they would respond to this question. We ask them to answer the way they would actually answer in a job interview. And so that may mean that they're answering truthfully, or it may mean that in an actual job interview, they would try to fudge the truth somehow. What we manipulated was whether this question was asked in either a general framing, a positive assumption framing, or a negative assumption framing. So here would be an example of the questions we used. In the negative assumption framing, we would say, in a typical week, you occasionally use work time for personal email or social media, right? So this is conveying, I assume this problem exists and I want to know whether you're willing to confirm this assumption that I'm making. So we know that we shouldn't use work time for personal email or social media. Maybe this is some way conveying that I think it's acceptable, but in general, it's conveying this assumption that I think this problem is present. Positive assumption is a very similar phrasing, but slightly changed. In a typical week, you don't occasionally use work time for personal email or social media, right? So we've only introduced that word don't, and we're going to see if that changes the responses that we get. General is going to be, by kind of the name of general here, much less specific. And so here we're asking, what can you tell us about your use of work time in a typical week? And so indeed, you might think that many respondents wouldn't answer that question by talking about their social media use or their personal email use. But a naive question asker, a naive interviewer might think that by asking, what can you tell us about your use of work time in a typical week, that I'm going to get a sense of whether they're kind of stealing time while on the clock. So that could be one of those kind of mispredictions in the general condition. All right, so here what we want are admission rates, and we don't know what the true admission rate is. We don't know whether participants actually use work time for social media or personal emails, but we can assume that they wouldn't say that they do it if they don't actually do it, or at least in most cases that wouldn't be the case in an interview that you would want to disclose this information. So we assume that higher admission rates are more truthful responses. We'll control for that in later studies, but that's the assumption that we're making here. Okay, and so in the general condition, I just clicked and nothing actually popped up. That's because there is 0% of the time in the general condition did people talk about using work time on personal email or social media. When you ask a general question, what can you tell me about how you use your work time? It just doesn't come up. People wouldn't think to admit to something like that when they could instead answer the question by saying something much more positive. In the positive assumption condition, there is some admission rates. We see it's about 18, 19% of the time that people are admitting that, yeah, they use some work time on personal email or social media. Whereas the negative assumption is all the way up to 28% of the time. We get an even higher admission rate. And remember, those two conditions are only different by one word, just whether we introduce that don't or not. And so it says that there's something really important about the words that we use, that we actually get really different admissions if we're asking it in this more direct negative assumption way. Right, so returning to the outline, here I'm giving kind of the answer to our questions. In study one, we show that negative assumption questions increase the likelihood of disclosure. And we actually get this kind of step function. Negative assumptions get more disclosure than positive assumption questions, get more disclosure than general questions. General questions often fail to get disclosures at all. In study two, which again, I'm not presenting in the interest of time, but we actually show that this effect persists in face-to-face interactions. And so here, rather than being a hypothetical job interview conducted online, we had people take the role of being a job interviewer and a job interviewee, and we show that this effect actually persists in face-to-face interactions. People are more likely to answer or more likely to disclose something that wouldn't actually benefit them, something that's harmful information, what we would consider truthful information, when they're asked negative assumption questions. And so now in study three, as I said before, we want to know whether the likelihood of disclosure is driven by our story. Is it that the reason we're disclosing these negative pieces of information because the question asker is perceived to be more knowledgeable and assertive? That's the story that we're trying to tell. So here we recruited participants, about 220 participants, to a negotiation study. And all of the participants here are assigned to the role of seller, and they're paired with who they believe to be another participant, but in reality is a research assistant. And so we call those Confederates. The term Confederate just means that it's a member of the research team pretending to be a participant. So in reality, all of the participants are assigned the role of seller and are negotiating with the Confederate over the sale of a used iPod. Gives you a sense of how old the study is, that we're talking about used iPods rather than newer pieces of technology. The motivation for the participants here is that as the seller, they're told that they would receive a bonus of 5% of the selling price. So it behooves them. It's motivating for them to get a higher and higher price, because that's actually going to get them a higher and higher financial bonus in this study. Meanwhile, they're kind of led to believe that the buyers have the opposite bonus in place, that a buyer would receive a bonus if they get a lower selling price. And so they realize that they're kind of at odds with each other, similar to how it would be in a real sales negotiation. The sellers want higher prices, the buyers want lower prices. Okay, so the participant is the seller. They're selling this used iPod. They're given a whole host of information about this iPod. I realize the text is very small. It's not all important, but we provide it here so that you can get a sense of what participants dealt with. We provide it to the participants so that it feels like there's enough information to take up this negotiation. What's important for our purposes, where the real manipulation comes in, is here. This is part of this list of information about the iPod. Here we're telling them that there's a problem, and it's up to them whether they want to disclose it to the Confederate, to the buyer. So the seller is told, overall, the iPod is in great working condition. The only problem you have had with it were 2 instances where the iPod froze. After freezing, you could not get the device restarted until you found a fix online that involved resetting the factory defaults and, as a result, deleting all your music. Thankfully, you had all your songs on the hard drive of your computer, so besides wasting a couple hours, no harm was done. In reality, this could be a really big problem. If I didn't know about this and put all my songs on a new iPod, or on a used iPod that I got from somebody, but didn't realize that at any given moment it might freeze and delete all of my songs, that could be really problematic. And so this is information that we think the seller wouldn't want to disclose, because it's going to make the buyer push for a lower price. But the buyer, of course, would want to know, because it affects the value of this product. All right, so then the manipulation, remember, all the participants are sellers. A member of the research team is the one that's pretending to be the buyer. So this is a fictitious buyer. And so we have our Confederate, our research assistant, type in this message to them. And so it says, okay, I'm supposed to go first. So you've had the iPod for 2 years. You'll notice that we have first spelled frist. That actually isn't a typo by me. It's a typo we use in studies like this to try to make it seem like real participants. I don't know exactly whether it works, but I just wanted to confirm to you that we aren't mistyping on this slide, but rather that that's a way that we actually try to manipulate the feeling of realness here, that we think other participants might have typos when they're in this study. All right, so the fictitious buyer says, okay, I guess I'm supposed to go first. So you've had the iPod for 2 years. And then what we manipulate is the second half of this sentence. So in the general condition, they say, so you've had the iPod for 2 years. What can you tell me about it? In the positive assumption condition, they say, so you've had the iPod for 2 years. It doesn't have any problems, does it? Right? Conveying this assumption that it's all great. Whereas the negative assumption condition, so you've had the iPod for 2 years. What problems does it have? Then the participant types their response, and then we code those responses in a few different, with independent coders. We go in and say, okay, did they admit to this problem with the iPod freezing, and some other details about those responses. After responding, then we say the chat is over, you've done this negotiation. The buyer is about to propose their price. While you're waiting for the buyer to send what price they would like to spend on this iPod, we want you to rate, you as the participant, to rate what you think of this buyer. How knowledgeable do you think they are? How assertive do you think they are? And so we're curious whether across those conditions, whether participants who are exposed to the general question are going to perceive the buyers to be less knowledgeable and less assertive than those assigned to the negative assumption condition, for instance. And so first, we want to see disclosure rates. And sure enough, there's huge differences in the disclosure. In the general condition, when people just say, what can you tell me about this iPod? Even though this is like a really important problem that would make you seem like kind of a scummy seller if you didn't disclose it. In the general condition, when they were just asked, what can you tell me about it? They only mentioned that the iPod froze less than 10% of the time. In the positive assumption condition, there aren't any problems with it, right? You're talking about problems. It maybe feels a little bit more uncomfortable to say, no, it doesn't have any problems. So here they're admitting it 60% of the time. In the negative assumption question, what problems does it have? They're admitting to it freezing and deleting some of their songs close to 90% of the time. So massive differences in disclosure of this important piece of information. And then, like I say, we want to see if there's this mechanism story in place, whether we've got our causal story right. And so we ask, how knowledgeable does the buyer seem? And so when you ask the negative assumption question, when you ask, what problems does it have? You seem more knowledgeable. You seem like you know what's going on more than if you were asked, it doesn't have any problems, does it? Or if you were to ask, what can you tell me about it? You seem more knowledgeable when you ask about problems directly in this negative assumption way. And you seem more assertive as well. And again, each of these differences between conditions is significant. So positive assumption seems more assertive than general. Negative assumption seems more assertive than positive. So that's really good support for our story that yes, indeed, you are seeming more knowledgeable, more assertive when you ask these kinds of questions. And so then we run what's called a mediation analysis. I'm not going to get into all the details, but you can kind of see the way this would work in an analytical framework, where when you ask the more specific questions, you're seen as more knowledgeable, which leads to more honest responses. That's a significant pathway that does explain our results. And if you ask more direct questions, right, those negative assumption questions, that makes you seem more assertive, which also leads to more honest responses. So it's going through both knowledge and assertiveness to get to more honest responses. That changing both of those perceptions is important here. Okay. So turning to kind of this outline, in study 1, which I showed you, and study 2, which I just described to you, negative assumption questions increase the likelihood of disclosure of problems, of negative information that people would prefer not to disclose. Negative assumption questions get at those better, including in face-to-face interactions. And in study 3, sure enough, disclosure of this useful information is driven by changes in perceived knowledge and assertiveness, that we wouldn't get people to be more honest in their responses, except for that the questions that they asked made them seem more knowledgeable and more assertive. So the takeaway here, kind of in a short, pithy statement, is to learn what we wish to know, we need to be willing to ask, right? That applies to our sensitive questions project as well. Here, the second part is, well, we can't just ask any question, we must ask the right questions. The questions we ask, the way that we phrase our questions, say something about ourselves. They're not just an opportunity to get information from somebody else. It's actually an opportunity for me to give information as well, to show you that I'm knowledgeable, to show you that I'm assertive, maybe to show you that I'm interested in something that you wouldn't have expected me to be interested in. You can imagine on a first date, if you ask questions about somebody else's job, you're not just getting information about somebody else's job, you're also conveying that you're interested in this other person's job, right? So we can't just ask any question, we must ask the right questions. And by asking the right questions, we can convey really useful information and help make better impressions on the people around us. So with that, I want to leave time for question and answer. I realize that it can be a little bit threatening potentially to ask a question when I just told that you need to ask the right questions, but I do want to leave it open to whatever questions that you might have. I'll leave this screen up here, so if you have any follow-up questions after the fact, feel free to email me at eric.vanepps@eccles.utah.edu, but I'd love to have any question or any discussions right now as well. Thank you. looks like some questions are coming in. Thank you all for participating in this online forum. I realize sometimes it's a little bit of delays, but I do appreciate your being here, participating, and looking forward to any questions that do start rolling in. Great. So the first question I see is, how does the culture or ethnic origin of those asking or responding affect your findings? And that's an interesting next step for future research. I don't have particular answers to that right now. We didn't specifically look at it or have reasons to expect differences, but what you might worry is whether, like, these issues of knowledge and assertiveness, whether those differ if you're coming from a certain culture or ethnic origin. That, sure enough, there's been evidence showing that minorities are often lied to more by car salesmen, as an example. They're treated worse, they're quoted higher prices, all of those kinds of things. And so you might wonder whether this applies as well if you were a minority asking about the problems with a used car, whether you get the same kind of effects as a white person. And we don't have data to expressly answer that question, but it does give, it might also be the case that maybe they're asking different questions in the first place. We think these patterns, these findings should apply across culture or ethnic origin. We don't have any reason to suggest they wouldn't, but it is an interesting next step to find out if you're a minority looking to buy a car, can you ask these kinds of direct, assertive questions and have the same kind of benefits that a white person would have? I would love to see a study look at exactly that. Apologies that I don't have more details at this time. Yeah. Okay, next question, how the ratings would be different if the participants were paired with someone they know casually, a coworker or neighbor, rather than someone anonymous for the sensitive questions. Yeah, so this was something, the sensitive questions project is still under review. We're still trying to get it through the publication process. And so this was a question that a reviewer asked us as well. And so we've run a new study where we had participants come into the lab with a friend, and then we randomly assigned them to either participate in the study with their friend or with somebody else's friend. So you were either with a friend or with a stranger. And what we found was that with friends, there was still a misprediction. So you still think that you're going to offend your friend more for asking sensitive questions than the friend actually is offended by asking sensitive questions, but you're slightly more accurate in your understanding of how the friend will respond. So what I mean by that is with strangers, you're kind of you're being especially risk averse, I think. With friends, you have a bit of a sense of whether this will offend them or not, but even with friends, we're overestimating the negative consequences of sensitive questions in the studies that we've run. And so, like I say, that's with a friend. You're asking, I guess, some about knowing casually, maybe something in between friend and stranger, like a coworker or a neighbor. And we haven't done that yet. My expectation is that it's going to be the same pattern of results, that you're going to continually think it's going to be worse to ask a sensitive question, but you might be a little bit more accurate the more and more you know about the other person. So it's an interesting idea. Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for participating in this forum and sharing this time with me. Would love to hear any additional ideas or questions. Often this is the kind of thing that sparks the next project that we end up working on, is hearing from audience members, hearing from people that we present to. So please do reach out at any point if you'd like to learn more about this, or if you just have an idea, something we can explore going forward. I appreciate your being here and hope that you got something useful out of this presentation. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you.